Welcome everyone to the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad Center for Transportation and Logistics Practitioner Webinar Session. IIMA Center for Transportation and Logistics is an interdisciplinary center with a vision to facilitate cutting-edge research in transportation, logistics, and allied areas, and thereby contribute to scholarship, practice, and policy making in India and abroad. Myself, Avidat, I am the AVP at the center and looking after administrative activities. So we have Dr. Christian with us. Let me quickly introduce the speaker. Dr. Christian is the Managing Director and the Senior Partner in the Vienna office of the BCG, Boston Consulting Group. He is a core team member of BCG's operation and TMT practice areas. As expert in high-end operations topics, he has worked with clients in the automotive and high-tech industries in Europe, the US, and the Asia. He specializes in large-scale procurement transformations with a focus on guiding supplier ecosystems and shaping the product life cycle for technology-driven clients. Prior to joining BCG, Christian was a partner at A.T. Kearney, where he led the procurement practice. He co-authored several books on procurement, such as The Purchasing Chessboard on Choosing the Right Methods to Reduce Cost, Supplier Relationship Management on Maximizing Value Received from Suppliers, and the CPO on how to build a world-class procurement organization. Christian obtained a MSc degree in aeromechanics and a PhD in artificial intelligence from TU Graz, Austria. He is fluent in German and English and speaks Spanish, Italian, and French. The topic for the talk today is the semiconductor chip shortage. What caused the supply crunch and how do firms navigate the situation? So thanks everyone for joining the session. Without further ado, I hand over to Dr. Christian.
Thank you, Abibel. Thank you for having me. So I'm Christian. So I've been a supply chain consultant for 27 years now, and I started my consulting career back in 1995 with a procurement project at the maker of premium cars in Germany. And I spent the subsequent 15 years in the automotive industry working for car makers all over the world. And as Avi already said, during that time, I started writing books, specifically the one you see on the right, so the purchasing chessboard. And in 2011, a PC maker was shocked by how badly the Fukushima earthquake had impacted their supply chain. And they invited me to speak about the purchasing chessboard. And this got me into the tech industry, working for several American OEMs and the suppliers in Taiwan, so companies like Foxconn and Wistron, who are quite well known in India by now. So therefore, I got deeply involved with managing the semiconductor supply chain. And today I'm leveraging this experience mostly for helping companies in automotive, engineering, and defense trying to master electronics. And I continue producing content, and I would like to point out two pieces. So on June 21st, my new book was published by Harvard Business Review. It is the one on the left, Profit from the Source. And also I'm hosting a YouTube channel called Procurement in the Park, and I encourage you to check it out. So let's dive into the content on the next slide. So here is how we define resilience. It is the capacity of a company to absorb stress, the ability to recover critical functionality, and to thrive in altered circumstances. So this is a definition that is not specific to supply chains or semiconductors, but I think it works quite well also in this context. So let's look at the visualization on the next slide. So I would like to explain this with what is happening in the current semiconductor crisis. And I will use this example throughout this webinar. See, if you look at the two graphs here, the blue one could be a tech company like Apple, for example, and the red one, any given car maker. But they both experienced the same semiconductor crisis, a fundamental shock and a threat to the companies. But the tech company pretty much absorbed the shock and is now doing better than ever before. While at the same time, the car maker is still ailing with much lower production volumes than before. And we will dive deeper into what makes the difference on the next slide. At a high level, we see 6 factors driving resilience. Anticipating and preparing for worst-case scenarios would require that you learn from the past. You might be excused if this was the first semiconductor crisis ever. But as we'll see later, semiconductor crises are coming every 3 to 5 years, so nobody should have been taken by surprise. Then you will be creating different types of capabilities to respond to a crisis. So you will have experts who understand the supply chain. You will have commercial and technical tools at hand. In the case of semiconductors, technical tools would encompass things like having pin-to-pin compatible alternatives readily available. So you will connect with the broader system to provide external buffer. So in the context of semiconductors, you would have your suppliers show you business continuity plans that prove that all your critical semiconductors are fabbed in at least 2 factories on 2 different continents. You will have visibility of the entire inventory in your supply chain, starting with wafers and die banks. You will not put all your eggs into one basket. And you will have boots on the ground as soon as you spot any deviation from the norm. In this context, consider that Apple had daily standing reservations for hundreds of business class seats from the US to China. Well, at least before the pandemic, that is. So next slide. So the nice thing about being a consultant is that we get to talk to a lot of companies across all industries. And it is fascinating to see how the topic of supply chain has gained traction over the past couple of years. In 2019, so just before the pandemic, a breakthrough in cost down was what was top of mind. Then in the second half of 2020, there was a lot of optimism and focus on innovation. 2021 was totally about security of supply. And now there's this notion that nothing can be relied upon anymore, and that companies need to be able to succeed in an extremely volatile environment. So there's a lot of concern about globalization being rolled back and about supply chains not being able to deliver anymore. So resilience is the name of the game right now. And people complain about surprises. And this is a notion that I would like to challenge to a certain extent on the next slide. So about 15 years ago, the idea of black swans became fashionable. And while it has its merits, it has become something of a lazy excuse. All this talk about black swans that are impossible to predict has distracted us from looking out for gray rhinos charging in our direction. Let me give you a real-time example. The recent lockdowns in China that have hurt many industries, including Apple. So one of my biggest current clients is a German car maker, and we're helping them in semiconductor management. And in one of our routine connecting the dot sessions in early January, we looked at China. And what we saw was a zero COVID policy, domestic vaccines that are okayish, but also not super effective, an underwhelming vaccination rate, especially among elderly people, and the highly infectious Omicron variant. And for us, it was absolutely certain that within a couple of months, parts of China would go into lockdown. So we systematically stocked up on components with high exposure to China. Does this completely protect us from the fallout of the lockdowns? No, but we're doing much better than our competitors. And mind you, we don't have a crystal ball. So all we did is get together once a month for a connecting the dots session and apply some logical thinking. So here's a question. Why did it take car makers 7 months to recognize that there's a semiconductor crisis? So let's look at this on the next slide. Dell, HP, and other PC makers have been in crisis mode since May 2020, or latest June 2020. Car makers noticed that something was going off track in December 2020 or January 2021. 7 months. Imagine what a car maker could have achieved in those 7 months had they recognized. And one of the car makers asked us how they could have noticed earlier. Would an AI scanning available reports have helped? As you can see on this slide, this would not have made a big difference. So German media was actually lagging the market. UK media were doing only marginally better. Mainland China media may have given them a head start of approximately 1 quarter. And following TSMC guidance would have yielded a similar result. So it turns out that the most effective measure would have been simply to talk to Dell or other PC makers. And I think there's a wider message here. If you buy a product, it is a good idea to talk to other companies that have high exposure to that product. And these companies should not be industry peers. All car makers made the same mistake. So if you're buying semiconductors, talk to a Dell. If you're buying plastics, talk to a Lego, and so on. And doing this makes a big difference, as we will see on the next slides. In 2021, the global automotive industry lost 10 million cars. This is more than 10% of the normal production volume. And basically all of this due to a shortage of semiconductors. And going forward, it's getting worse, not better. But it doesn't have to be like this, as we will see on the next slide. So while other car makers lost 10 million vehicles, Tesla grew by 87%. So let me repeat this, 87%, 87%. So Tesla almost doubled deliveries in 2021. And they were still going strong in Q1 until their factory in Shanghai was shut down due to COVID. Apple is a similar story. Record after record and remarkably strong delivery performance with the exception of iPad. And again, until their ODM factories in China were hit by lockdowns. So let's now dive deeper into semiconductors. Before I said that semiconductor crises come every 3 to 5 years. Now the fascinating thing is that most companies don't learn from these experiences. They let the crisis blow over and then go back to business as usual. And let me share an observation from a car maker, a typical car maker from the beginning of the semiconductor crisis in January last year, so 2021. The car maker would mostly fly blind. They would not know which semiconductors they had in their cars. They did not know the vendors making the semiconductors, and they had zero relationship to these vendors. Now, if you ask me why this is, despite this quite high frequency of semiconductor crisis, I cannot give you a clear answer. So maybe the supply chain is too difficult to understand, as we will see on the next slide. This is the long and complex semiconductor supply chain. So IC vendors, the NXPs of this world, are mostly combining Lego blocks of off-the-shelf software and IP from vendors like ARM to come up with a design. The physical supply chain is starting with wafers in an in-house fab or an outsourced foundry. And bottlenecks can occur everywhere. There can be a shortage of wafers. There may be a lack of capacity in the foundry. So the OSAT may not have sufficient testing fixtures, lead frames, or IC substrates, or some of the other ICs or passive components that get packaged into the product that customers ultimately buy. And then there's the software that can be added anywhere, at the OSAT, by the distributor, or even in tier 1 factories. And this picture is further complicated by the fact that all of the players shown here are trying to expand upstream and downstream and are competing with each other. So what keeps us busy is the fact that this supply chain is hypersensitive to external shocks. We have seen this with the Texas deep freeze a year ago, the lockdown in Malaysia and Vietnam in September that impacted OSATs, and the recent lockdown in Shanghai. But there also is a longer-term concern with the supply chain. It is structurally unstable, and we can already see what will cause the semiconductor crisis of the future. So let's look at this more in detail on the next slides. There are more than 50 choke points in this supply chain. So when I say choke point, I refer to something similar to the Ever Given being stuck in the Suez Canal and blocking it. We define such choke points as a region that holds more than 60% of the global capacity. So here's one example. Just recently, the world was reminded that 80% of the neon gas required to run lasers used in foundries comes from Ukraine, specifically from the cities of Mariupol and Odessa. What we're seeing on this slide is a fascinating, highly complex supply chain that wraps itself around the world, a product of globalization. Thomas Friedman from the New York Times was not wrong when he praised global supply chains like this one as one of the wonders of the modern world. But as we know, globalization is going into reverse. To further illustrate this point, let me draw your attention to the middle of this slide, where it says front-end wafer fabrication, where you see a lot of Korean and Taiwanese flags. So let's dive deeper into this on the next slide. So here you see the wafers, where the wafers are made. So the fabs and foundries, or what is referred to as front end. And I wanted to focus on the portion labeled logic. These are basically the chips that run our products. So all the CPUs, GPUs, and 5G modems. You will see that the more advanced the node is, or in other words, the smaller the nanometer count, the more likely is that it is made in Taiwan. At 10 nanometer, we have 92% in Taiwan. If we look into 5 nanometer, so this is the node size of the current generation of Apple's A series and M series chips, we have 100% made in Taiwan. So without Taiwan, without one Taiwanese company, TSMC to be precise, there are no more smartphones, no modern computers, and no modern cars with self-driving capability. I'll let this sink in for a moment. Let's now look at the market and what caused the current semiconductor shortage. What you see here is semiconductor demand and supply. The red line shows you the highly seasonal demand. The seasonality is driven by back to school in August, the smartphone season that starts in September, Black Friday, Christmas, and Chinese New Year. Historically, we had supply exceeding demand between February and August, but this is over now. The gray line shows you production capacity. It is growing steadily, but in 2020, growth was a bit less than planned. And this was caused by safety and health measures at the construction sites. With the beginning of the pandemic, we had unprecedented demand that was driven by homeschooling, home office, the 5G rollout, and the associated cloud services. And it was further boosted by stimulus packages, with consumers not being able to spend money on experiences, like going on vacation, and instead spending on products. And at the bottom, we have the annual sums. In 2020, demand exceeded supply by 1 percentage point. And that already caused huge disruptions. But in 2021 and this year, the gap was and will be even greater than in 2020. And we can expect the current crisis to continue well into 2023. Now, before you ask me, so this model is based on very granular bottom-up information, both from customers of semiconductors, where we go down to individual product lines like the iPhone at Apple, and from all the fabs and foundries around the world making semiconductors, where we go down to the installed production capacity at production line by production line. So on the next slide, we split demand and supply lines by product type. And unfortunately, with the exception of memory, there are no good news here. So for logic, MEMS, and analog, we have gaps between demand and supply for this year greater than 7.5 percentage points. And discrete and opto are just marginally better. Well, and of course, there's not only the perspective of product types, but also of wafer sizes and node sizes. And the latter, so node sizes, is an area of deep misunderstanding that we will cover on the next slide. So we had this case of a CEO of a company in industrial automation and energy management who was thoroughly confused by talking to semiconductor companies. Within 1 week, he had met with key executives from Intel, STMicro, and TSMC. Intel told him he would need to bring everything under 20 nanometers. STMicro told him anything between 20 and 100 nanometers was just fine. And TSMC was even more extreme than Intel, suggesting that the safe space was well below 10 nanometers. Well, debunking this was not too difficult. The motivation of suppliers was, of course, the node sizes that they were currently investing in. But there are more false rumors. So one of them is that car makers use only legacy nodes, while tech companies only use leading nodes. So let's look at the car first on the next slide. So here's the semiconductor content of a typical premium car. Think of a BMW or a Tesla. 2 key figures here. In the car, we have about 2,000 semiconductors. And combined, these 2,000 semiconductors require a die area of about 7,000 square millimeters. Now, 17% of the semiconductors in the car are made at process nodes smaller than 20 nanometers. Now, we will pause here. I would like the audience to guess how this ratio looks like for an iPhone. So make up your number. Julia, let's switch to the next slide. Okay, so we have 27%. So 27% in an iPhone versus 17% in a premium car. So yes, the iPhone uses a higher proportion of leading node semiconductors, but we are still very much in the same ballpark, in the same order of magnitude. And this tells us a super important message. In this semiconductor crisis, everybody is competing with everyone for the very same resources. Apple is directly competing with Tesla and BMW, and all of them are competing with everyone using semiconductors. So next one. And you also shouldn't be too concerned that any of the node sizes is going to disappear. So despite all the noise coming out of the market, capacity across all node sizes is growing. Maybe not in the region you prefer, but they are growing. And specifically, mature nodes are growing almost as fast as leading nodes. So you and your suppliers can continue picking the semiconductors that are right for the application without being pushed by semiconductor vendors into a direction you're not comfortable with. Okay, and we are now getting close to the completion of my talk. And before we open up to the plenary, a view on what needs to be done in order to manage semiconductors successfully. So a bit of a personal story here. And I already touched upon this in the intro. So this is my third semiconductor crisis. The first one in 2011 got me into the PC industry. In 2017 and 2018, I helped the PC maker mitigate the semiconductor shortage that was not as severe as the one we're experiencing now. Then it felt a bit like the fable of the hare and the tortoise. Wherever we went, Apple had already been there. They had excellent contacts to the boardrooms of all the relevant makers of semiconductors. And for example, they had their own part numbers, which shielded them from activities like allocation or fair share. For the PC maker, this served as a major wake-up call and they vowed that this will never happen to them again. And in the semiconductor crisis, they are now doing much better than their competitors. And if you look at the automotive industry, you can pretty much correlate the speed at which OEMs are learning from the tech industry to how well they're getting through this crisis. Some were learning fast, and last year they pretty much built the cars they had planned to build, while everyone else lost 10%, 20%, or even 30% of cars. And on the next slide, we can take a look at what this best practice approach to manage semiconductors looks like. So under retain supply chain focus, you want to ensure that you and your suppliers are placing non-cancelable, non-refundable orders over an appropriate time horizon. For car makers, this is typically 18 to 24 months. Ensuring means that you double check. We have seen that time and again suppliers hesitate. Encourage them and make it clear that you will buy the semiconductors and cover any extra cost. Under optimize within the current environment, we'll want to manage the inventory needed to make your products next week, next month, and next quarter. Monitor the market. So when Shanghai goes into lockdown, this should not surprise you, and you should have bought inventory upfront. And if you should be surprised, be the first to buy from brokers who you trust. In interactions with suppliers, you will also want to turn yourself from a beggar asking for parts to an interesting business partner, a customer that has strategic potential for the suppliers. This is a competition for executive mindshare. You want your semiconductor vendors to spend more time thinking about you than about your competitors. You may not be the biggest customer, but the key here is to punch above your weight. There always is an angle to be interesting for relevant people, so we just have to find it. Under Shape Your Future, we increase our business continuity plan readiness. We verify that for every relevant semiconductor we buy, there's a sufficient capacity booked in the fabs and foundries, that the raw wafers are available, that the lead frames, IC substrates, and testing fixtures are available at the OSATs. And we ask the IC vendors to tell us if they have any concerns with our choice of semiconductors. And if they have a concern, we see what we can redesign in the short term, where we have pin-to-pin compatible semiconductors, and we review all the engineering projects going on for us to design in resilience. And finally, we need to have a clear opinion on the semiconductors we want to have in our products and why we want to have these specific ones. We pick those that have a great performance in our products and those that the semiconductor vendors that we trust will deliver reliably. And we instruct the tier ones to deploy these semiconductors and eliminate everything else from our BOMs. Or let me summarize this in more simple terms, in one key recommendation for supply chain risk management. You need to intimately know your suppliers. You need to intimately know the suppliers of your suppliers. And you need to intimately know the suppliers of these suppliers. And before we end, I would like to take a minute to talk about my new book. So Profit from the Source is Boston Consulting Group's first book on operations. And Profit from the Source is Harvard's, so HBR's first book on procurement. The premise of the book is that there's an incredible discrepancy. Companies spend at least half of their budget on suppliers, yet according to recent research by Harvard, CEOs on average just spend 7 minutes per day on suppliers, and this cannot be right. In our book, we outline what companies can gain by putting suppliers in the center. And we show how to do this and illustrate this with many examples. We would like to say that Profit from the Source is a paradigm-shifting manual for radical change. And this manual for change is structured in 3 big sections: how the CEO, how the company, and how the company supply ecosystem need to change. With this, we can open for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks. So, I have one question. Let me start with that, and then we will take the questions from the participants. So, you mentioned about the visibility and understanding risk, for automobile companies in such kind of shortages, semiconductor shortages. Can you, be more elaborative in terms of what did Tesla do different? In terms of either upfront order booking or investing in suppliers, and what are the activities which were long-term in nature and what were short-termish in nature? Can you elaborate and share your experience?
Yeah. Okay. So let me maybe start by describing how traditional car makers did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so traditional car makers pretty much outsource the decision-making for semiconductors to their suppliers, to the tier 1 suppliers. The tier 1 suppliers, given all this freedom, optimized along 2 vectors. Lowest cost for them and convenient. So reuse across their modules. So when the crisis hit, the car makers had zero visibility. And with all the complexity, and that's also one difference between traditional car makers and Tesla. So if you look at the traditional car maker, you see all this wide product complexity, 50 different models in endless different trim levels. And Tesla basically has, don't know how you look at it, 2 or 4 different models with very limited trim levels. So all of this together resulted in an unmanageable zoo of semiconductors. Compare this with Tesla, completely different culture, completely different legacy. So they are across the San Francisco Bay from Apple. So heavily influenced by the tech industry. In essence, Tesla is a tech company that makes computers on wheels. So they had very, very clear opinions on which semiconductors to use, why they use them, by nature, by culture. They were very close to the tech industry. And Tesla owns the entire tech stack, software, hardware. So for them, if they really run into a problem and they have to replace a microcontroller, for example, they can do it in-house mostly. So it is an effort, right? It is a software development effort, it is a testing effort, but it can probably be done within a couple of months. In the automotive industry, super hard to do that because the knowledge is probably at the tier 1. The tier 1 supplier is not super excited about replacing this. And then changing a microcontroller in the automotive industry is believed to take something like 18 months. And this is so long that who knows if what's going to happen in 18 months, right? So Tesla, very compact, very, very clear, very much tech focused, owning the tech stack. So by definition, having fewer problems. And these fewer problems they could address with laser focus. So if they needed to change, they did change. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah. There is a question by the participant, Gursimran Singh. So, Doctor, you mentioned about in your talk about punching above the weight. Can you give some levers and explain how can one exactly do this? And even if they are not the biggest customer of that vendor, so a small customer, what are the levers that he can use to negotiate and to have a better deal?
Well, the interesting thing is everybody we talk to believes that they are too small. Everybody. So just yesterday I had a discussion with a client. Oh, we are too small. I said, well, that's not the right way to look at this. It's not about how relevant you are to the tech companies, to the semiconductor vendors. The question is how relevant are they to you, right? And what can you do to change this? And you find this is at all levels, right? So that client I was talking to yesterday, they're in industrial automation. They feel small, but also the car makers feel small, because if you look at the car makers, the automotive industry takes 10% consumes 10% of semiconductors made by value. And the biggest car makers have less than 10% market share in the automotive industry. So this means the biggest car makers consume less than 1% of the semiconductors made. So you could even argue that even the biggest car maker is too small to be relevant. But it doesn't work like this, right? So at the supplier, at the semiconductor vendor, you need to find the right person who is interested in you, in your slice of business, for geographical reasons, for growth perspectives, for qualification. So how does working for you qualify them to grow? Just at a very high level, so you could say the home industry of the semiconductor players would be PCs and smartphones. And while these industries are big, they consume a lot of semiconductors, they are normally not growing. They did grow during the pandemic because of homeschooling and home office. But without the pandemic, they would not grow. And probably now, during the pandemic, people having bought so many laptops, desktops, tablets, and smartphones, you can expect that going forward, demand will be suppressed. So all of these companies are looking for growth opportunities in automation, regional opportunities. So again, as I said in the talk, the task is to punch above your weight, and it takes a lot of creativity to find the right people at the semiconductor vendors. It takes persistence, but we have seen that at all sizes of clients, there is a way to be relevant.
So this answers. There is a question by the participant Niharika Singh. So from sustainability viewpoint, how companies can strategize while keeping the suppliers in center in order to manage the relationship with existing suppliers? Basically, a sustainability perspective, your viewpoint about how to keep the suppliers in center.
So this is not sustainability in terms of carbon emissions and social and so, but it is more, so how can we have meaningful relationships to the suppliers? Just to understand the question. Let me also look at the questions in the chat. Well, I'm not entirely sure that I understand the question fully. Just in terms of supplier relationship management, I think it is important to look at, or let me start differently. Typically, industrial companies, car makers, other companies in traditional industry, they tend to treat all suppliers the same. So small, irrelevant stuff gets the same attention of details. The suppliers needs to jump to the same hoops. And we believe this is wrong. I think you need to very much differentiate and focus very much on the suppliers that truly matter. And at the high level, these are two types of suppliers. So the suppliers that are big for you now. So typically companies have 20 to 40 suppliers account for half of the spend of a company. So these need special attention, very much CEO to CEO discussion. But these suppliers are not necessarily the ones for the future. So again, let's think about automotive industry. So the 20 to 40 biggest supplier for a car maker probably have a lot to do with internal combustion engines. And as we all know, the future of the car is not internal combustion engine, but batteries and electric drives. So you also need to add to these suppliers that matter, those who enable the future, so those with high strategic potential. And you need to keep both of these suppliers very close to you. So capture their mind share. And suppliers understand what you're doing with them. So if you are inconsistent, they will move elsewhere. So in that respect, sustainability in supplier relationship management very much means treat them with respect and honesty, and then they will do the same to you. Now, should the other definition of sustainability have been meant? I think this is also very relevant. All the products that companies are selling, so the suppliers have an overwhelming impact on for example, the carbon footprint of the products. And it will be interesting to see how CEOs of companies who made these big, lofty promises about becoming carbon neutral, how they're going to achieve this by not really engaging, talking to suppliers at an adequate level. So I hope somehow this answered the question.
And there is a question by Raghu Menon. Do you see such automobile or technology OEMs forming industry consortiums to control the supply chain in the future? Is there a synergy between all the affected stakeholders to form such consortiums?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. So as car makers are trying to become tech players, implicitly or explicitly, working with the tech industry. So we have examples of this, public examples like Stellantis, which used to be called Fiat Chrysler Automotive and PSA of France, now Stellantis. They have a strong alliance with Foxconn. So the Apple supplier making iPhones and so on. So generally speaking, I believe that this has a lot of potential. But the question will be, how successful will be the transformation of a traditional car maker to become a tech company in this race against pure play, like tech-oriented car makers like Tesla, and like the many kind of, for example, Chinese companies who are like NIO and so on, who are also emulating the Tesla model. So who will be faster? So how quickly can the new starters, without all the legacy, ramp up and deploy their business model at scale? Or will the traditional car makers be faster, especially if they partner with selected tech players? So the question is open.
And there's a question by Lakshmi. What can a developing country like India do to avoid another semiconductor shortage? There have been some news going about fabrication starting up and MOUs being signing up in the country. So more of a geopolitical angle means how do countries should respond?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, there should be awareness for semiconductor consumption in a country or in a region, and semiconductor production in a region. For example, in Europe, there's a huge mismatch. So Europe consumes twice as many semiconductors as it produces. I think this warrants a look at these 50 bottlenecks, chokepoints that I referred to in the talk. And if you look at what's happening in North America, what is happening in Europe, right? So there's a lot of money being made available, especially being poured into leading nodes. But generally speaking, I think the advice to India should be to become not fully self-sufficient, but at the same time avoid being completely dependent on imports.
So there's a question by Nilesh. With demands not catching up with supply till 2025, what shall be the sourcing strategies moving forward? Do companies need to have multiple supplier approach to secure supply short-term and long-term? And also strategy versus single source supplier and multiple source supplier.
Well, I wouldn't be concerned about single sourced. The issue is not to have one supplier. That's not the problem, because as we discussed before, it's super hard to replace a semiconductor, regardless how many suppliers you have. So the car makers today, by delegating all decision authority to the tier 1 suppliers, ultimately they have many semiconductor suppliers. But this doesn't help you, right? Because if one of the semiconductors is not available and it takes 18 months to replace this semiconductor, a lot of suppliers doesn't help you. What you need is, quite in contrary, I believe you should have a manageable number of suppliers semiconductor suppliers. You need very close relationship to these suppliers. And then for the products you get from the semiconductor suppliers, you need a clear business continuity plan. So you would like to see that all of your semiconductors are fabbed in 2 different fabs or foundries, ideally in 2 different continents. So if you have 2 fabs in Texas, and then you have another Texas deep freeze, this doesn't help you. So ideally, let's have 1 fab in India and 1 fab in, don't know where, in Europe or so. It's unlikely that the same disaster strikes both places.
There's a question by Nilesh. Chip manufacturing companies are also using instruments which consumes semiconductors. And they are also showing shortage issue.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes.
And will that slow down manufacturing side?
Well, they are, depending on the node size, you are very quickly running down a very, very short list of suppliers who can do this, right? So it's probably, it boils down to Applied Materials, ASML, and a couple of others, right? I mean, these machines are made in low volumes. And I think one of the surprising insights of the semiconductor crisis is that small is beautiful. So truck makers are typically getting the crisis better than car makers because their volume is so small that a semiconductor vendor can satisfy them. Okay, give you a couple of pieces and you're good. You cannot do this for a car maker with much bigger volume. So I think ultimately the bottleneck for the equipment makers will not be so much the shortage of supply, because you can always prioritize that. And as you outlined, I mean, this is pretty straightforward for everyone, that you know that these companies making the equipment should have priority over almost everybody else. The issue is more now the availability of their people, of the capacity of their factories. So now, even if India, America, Europe pour in a lot of money into building lots of fabs and foundries, the capacity is not there. So of course, money is an issue. But even if you had all the money of the world, you can still not double the semiconductor manufacturing capacity from one day to another, because simply the equipment is not there, the people are not there. So it's very, very difficult to suddenly ramp up equipment production, and then to get this equipment running in a fab.
There is this question by Brijesh Patel. Would you agree if I may suggest that chip makers abandoned car industry supply chain with the immediate future use being bleak, like comparing with aviation and crude situations? Or you would see this as a 3 to 5 year cycle? Krishna, shall I repeat that? There's a question in the Q&A. Would you agree if I may suggest that chip makers abandoned the car industry supply chain with the immediate future use being bleak, like comparing with aviation and crude situations? Or you would see this? Okay.
I don't think they would abandon the, and again, not sure that I fully understood the question, but I see no indication whatsoever that chip makers would abandon the automotive industry or have abandoned the automotive industry. Quite in contrary. So just a couple of numbers here. So a traditional car with internal combustion engine has a semiconductor content of about $500. An electric car with some self-driving capability has a semiconductor content of $2,000. So 4 times as much. So why would you abandon this? So this is, I don't think there are many markets growing at that rate.
Right.
So it's a highly attractive market, even though a somewhat complicated market, because so much is in flux, right? So far the semiconductor makers talk to the tier 1 suppliers. Now the OEMs, the car makers, also coming into the game. So there's a lot of moving parts, but there's absolutely no indication that chip makers are abandoning automotive.
Yeah, so we are done with the Q&A. I have one more question, one second. Yeah, so we are done with the Q&A. Let me check. We'll take the last question.
Yeah.
So by Nilesh, in such a difficult supply chain scenario, how to address opportunistic suppliers who are taking undue advantage by offering very high prices and do not promise any supply security?
Yeah, I mean, again, depends on what we are talking about. So, I mean, if you think about how you can get semiconductors at short notice, so you're dealing with brokers. So brokers are companies who buy excess inventory and then sell it. And the multiple can be 2x, 5x, 10x, 50x, 200x. I think you need to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis. It still may make sense. So if you want to build a car that costs $50,000 and you're lacking one semiconductor, even if that semiconductor normally costs $1, and then you pay $200 for this semiconductor, it may still make sense to buy a 200x multiple. I think here the question is not so much is the price fair or not, but is the source legit? Because there are also bad actors in this industry that promise you all kinds of things, and then in the end you pay a lot of money for a bad product. So the challenge here is to weed out the good actors and so to separate the bad ones from the good ones. But I think these brokers absolutely have a reason to be, and they can be very, very useful. So our recommendation to companies is groom a very small number of brokers you trust, 2 to 3. Have a really, really good relationship to them. And then when you need them, use them.
So we come to the end of the session. Professor Roy. So thanks, Dr. Christian. It was a very nice, exciting session with a lot of interest. Yeah, Professor Roy. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christian. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thanks to all the participants also. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Christian. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.